Welcome, everyone, to episode 10 of EV Society's Canada Talks Electric Cars webinar. My name is Tim Burrows, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. I'd like to take just a moment to thank the good people at Oshawa Power for joining the webinar as our newest sponsor and for supporting our ongoing efforts to help in Canada's transition to electric mobility. Electric Vehicle Society, as most of you know, is a national organization. A lot of you, I realize, are already members. And if by chance through all this craziness, you've let your annual subscription membership expire, we'd appreciate you taking just a few minutes to go back in and renew that membership. It means a lot to us. As you know, membership's only $30 a year. And if you've reached the age of wisdom, you can be a member for just $20 a year. Whether you're a member or not, you're welcome to come to any of our virtual meetings. You can just visit evsociety.ca for information about when those things occur and how to join in. A reminder to you all that this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel for later viewing. Today's webinar will run as usual for no longer than 60 minutes. All guests have joined the webinar with their cameras off and their microphones muted. You're encouraged to ask our guest speaker questions, and you can ask them at any time during the presentation. Just use that little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. It doesn't interfere while the speaker is performing. Note that you also, if you see any questions already posted by other attendees in that Q&A that you would really like to hear answered yourself, you can upvote that question and it will get raised to the top, and we'll be sure to get to it before we run out of time. Tonight, one of our great EV Society members, Jason Arnaud, will be taking us through the speaker's questions and your questions immediately following the presentation. Today's webinar is called The Importance of EV Policy in Canada's Clean Energy Future and will be presented by Joanna Kyriazis. Before I formally introduce Joanna, I'd like to conduct a simple poll. And what we'd like to do here is just learn a little bit about your views on what EV-related policy should look like. And you should be seeing that poll on your screen now. I will read the questions out simply because the folks who may be watching this later on our YouTube channel will not see this poll. It doesn't record. So the choices for great ideas for, and I should mention that you can vote up to 2 different items here. If there are 2 things you think are equally important, you can vote for more than one. Higher EV purchase rebates, more public charging stations, home charger rebates, requirement to install charging stations in new residential builds, strengthen fuel efficiency standards, higher carbon tax. Those are the options that we've put there for you, and the votes are coming in. We've got about half the room now voting, and I'll leave it for just a minute or two. A little longer list of questions today, so we'll just give another minute. We're up to almost 90%, still coming in though. All right, I think we're going to hold it. We'll stop about here. Still trickling in. We've got 94% of the room voting, 95, 96. Okay, I think I will end it there. And let's take a look at what the room believes to be important. So it looks like 72% of the group think higher EV purchase rebates are critical piece of policy, which makes sense. I think it's somewhat intuitive. More public charging stations. About half of you chose that as one of the key policies that we should be looking at. Home charger rebates, a little bit lower, about 19% of the room. 34% of the room thought a requirement to install charging stations in new residential builds was an important policy. 17% think we should just strengthen fuel efficiency standards as a solution or as a policy item. And finally, a higher carbon tax. Interesting in this crowd that 1/3 of the room think a higher carbon tax would be beneficial in terms of policy. So thank you for that. We'll see what our guest speaker has to say on some of those items. So I'll end that. So Joanna is a senior policy advisor at Clean Energy Canada. She works to develop and advance policy solutions that address climate change while promoting clean growth with a specific focus on clean transportation. Based in Ottawa, she regularly connects with thought leaders, industry stakeholders, and policymakers at the federal level. Before joining Clean Energy Canada, Joanna worked as a management consultant, helping businesses identify and manage climate change risks and opportunities. She also practiced as a lawyer, advising governments and industry on climate change and energy law. So, hey, Joanna, welcome to Canada Talks Electric Cars webinar.
Hi there, Tim. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, that's terrific. Well, I think we're all pretty much aware of just how much impact government policy can have on adoption. And so this is really an important topic, I think, to be discussing. You mentioned the other day that government has been reaching out a lot lately about EV policy. You think we should take that as an encouraging sign?
Yes, I do. I have to say both media outlets and government are focusing a lot on electric vehicles right now. And so I'm looking forward to speaking with the group and hearing some of the questions, and also just kind of sharing some opportunities to for them to share their views with government.
Awesome. Okay, Joanna. Well, I'm going to turn the screen and the microphone over to you. Break a leg.
All right. Thanks, Tim. Okay, so let's get started. Today or this evening, my presentation is going to cover both policies that work to accelerate adoption of electric vehicles, so get Canadians driving more electric vehicles, but also, Clean Energy Canada likes to think about how we're going to shift Canada's economy to sort of be a participant in the clean energy transition. And so we want to see more clean growth and new industries. And so we're really looking at this issue from both an EV adoption, but also an opportunity to revitalize our auto sector. Okay, so if anybody has heard Clean Energy Canada talk about electric vehicles, you may have heard us use this term, Canada's car conundrum. And what we see as Canada's car conundrum is that there are two troubling trends. The first is that our transportation emissions are up. So our transportation sector is already the second largest source of carbon pollution in Canada. Number one is oil and gas. And while a number of other sectors of the economy are seeing a relative downward trend in greenhouse gas emissions, transportation emissions over the last 20 years have risen by about 30%. Now, it's easy to assume that the problem is something like, airline emissions or heavy duty trucking. And of course, those contribute. But a big part of what's causing this rise is actually the cars that you and I drive. And a major trend is that Canadians, more so now than ever before, are choosing larger, more polluting vehicles like pickup trucks, vans, and SUVs. Probably I should limit it to pickup trucks and SUVs. Vans are not so much on the up and up. But as you can see from this graph, in the last 20 years, we've seen a pretty remarkable swap in consumer preferences. So no longer do sedans dominate new car sales. It's now the pickup truck and SUVs. Now, over this same time period, Canada's auto sector has been in decline. That's the second troubling trend, making up Canada's car conundrum. So in the early 2000s, Canada was actually among the top 5 vehicle manufacturing countries around the world. Now we've dropped all the way down to 12th. And what that looks like is we're seeing about 1 million less vehicles being produced every year in Canada. Now, this, of course, these two trends are bad news for the environment and bad news for our economy. But there is a solution, and that is zero-emission vehicles. We want to get more Canadians driving those vehicles, and we want to build more of those cars here in Canada. Now, historically, this is a graph from 2018, Canada has underperformed when it came to electric vehicle production. Other countries tended to produce kind of a similar ratio or a similar percentage of global electric vehicles as they did global gas cars, whereas Canada, wasn't really capturing its piece of the pie. Now, of course, we're starting to see things change and shift as of late. And so just in the past few months, we've seen investments by all three of the Detroit big three automakers to bring electric vehicle production to Canada. So Ford Motor Company announced an almost $2 billion investment to build 5 EV models in its Oakville plant. Fiat Chrysler, now Stellantis, made a similar announcement where it plans to retool one of its facilities and start producing, I think, at least one electric vehicle here. And then General Motors announced its plans to convert its Ingersoll plant and start producing commercial or delivery vans that are electric. And so that's nearly $6 billion just in the last few months. And I think, it was just over this weekend, the New York Times actually covered it. And it was pretty interesting to see that Canada was getting some international recognition about this turning point and how we're really catching up in the global race to produce zero emission vehicles. Now, of course, the work isn't done, but signs of hope. Now, one other issue that I wanted to raise was, I think, there have been a lot of surveys done in recent years, and there was one just in the last few weeks by KPMG looking at, how ready are Canadians to buy electric vehicles. And all of the surveys that we're seeing show that a majority of Canadians who plan to buy a car in the next 5 or so years, they're planning to go electric or at least purchase a hybrid car. Often we hear about barriers such as the higher upfront costs of an electric vehicle, which it's true that is still a barrier for many Canadians. And we expect it to continue to be until EVs reach until they become competitively priced, not on a lifetime basis, because they already are cheaper to operate, but we want to see electric vehicle sticker prices come down to be competitive with similar gas models, and that's expected to happen around the mid-2020s. Charging is also a very common barrier that we hear about, as well as kind of a lack of familiarity with the technology. One barrier that gets less airtime, but is a serious problem that Canadians need to acknowledge and that policy needs to address, is that Canada has an EV supply problem. And so a study done for Transport Canada last year surveyed dealerships across the country and found that about 70% of dealerships didn't have a single electric vehicle on their lot to test drive or to purchase. The survey also found that wait times of about 3 to 6 months or more were typical if a Canadian decided that he or she wanted to buy an EV anyways. So this is a barrier to going electric. Most people aren't able to wait 6 months for their new car, and they want to be able to go and test drive and see what an electric car feels like, especially if they're switching technologies. Now, the picture is slightly different across Canada, and in British Columbia and Quebec, you see much higher percentage of electric vehicle sales, but also a larger inventory of EVs on dealership lots. So all the EVs are going to those two provinces. Yes, these two provinces offer rebates that can be combined with the federal rebate. That is certainly a pull. But a policy that these two provinces also have is called Zero-Emission Vehicle Standard, which requires automakers to sell a minimum percentage of electric cars in those jurisdictions. And that minimum percentage will rise over time. Now, driving electric vehicles presents real opportunities, and I assume that a lot of folks on the call are already EV owners, and so I'm probably telling you something that you already know. But when we looked at the data out there and compared kind of cost savings across provinces, we found that a typical Canadian EV driver could expect to save between $800 and $2,000 a year on fuel, and then another few $100s on maintenance, because electric vehicles cost less to charge up than the gas cars cost to fuel, and EVs have fewer moving parts, and so don't require as frequent repairs. Similarly, they don't require those kind of annual tune-ups like an oil change. When it comes to environmental performance, we also found that an electric car will pollute or emit less carbon pollution than a similar gas model, no matter what province in Canada you live in. And so often we will get the question, are EVs really that good for the environment? And are they still good for the environment if you live in a province that relies on coal power for electricity? And that's a great question. But even in provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Nova Scotia that still rely on some coal power for their electricity, EVs still performed better. Of course, not as well as those that are being driven in places like Manitoba and Quebec. And then finally, the great thing about electric vehicles is that as we do decarbonize Canada's electricity grid, so Alberta was planning to phase out coal by 2030. Now it looks like it's going to happen as early as 2023. That means that the electric cars that are plugging in to Canada's electricity grid will get cleaner as well. Now, on the kind of economic development side, there's a real opportunity for Canada, not just to assemble electric vehicles, but also to build out an entire EV supply chain. And you might notice there's been a lot of talk about this opportunity in the news lately. It's been referred to as Canada's mines to mobility advantage. And so, yes, Canada's home to all of the critical metals and minerals that you need to build an EV and their batteries. We've got nickel, cobalt, copper, graphite, lithium. And so the reserves are there. We've got to do some more to start producing, but they're there. When it comes to batteries, we've got leading battery researchers. I'm sure a lot of folks are aware of the Tesla Research Center in Nova Scotia that's connected with Dalhousie University and Jeff Dawn. We've got, I believe, where's the other? I believe that there's some leading research around EVs as well as automation and AI at the University of Toronto and just generally in the Southern Ontario area. We've got some companies that are already building batteries. Corvus Energy builds batteries for ferries. Electrovaya has been building batteries for forklifts. So there's a lot of pieces in the battery space as well. Again, though, still pretty small scale, needs some more support to scale up. we've got a number of clean tech companies that are ready to feed into the electric vehicle battery value chain. Everything from companies in Alberta that are finding ways to extract lithium from the brine of oil field wastewater, to some of, I believe we are home to 2 of 3 of the North American leading companies that are recycling battery materials. So they're able to recover. 2 of them are called Life Cycle, that's based in Ontario, and then Lithium, which is based in Quebec. They're able to recover up to, I believe, 95% of the critical materials coming out of batteries, and then reintroduce those into the battery supply chain, which is excellent because it helps to avoid the need for new mines. And then finally, we've obviously got a strong manufacturing base in Canada. So that includes the EV assembly, but also a robust network of auto parts suppliers ready to go. And Canada is already leading on production of electric buses and other medium and heavy duty vehicles. Now, when we looked at what was going on in other countries that are really leading on electric vehicle uptake, but also making sure that their auto sectors were capturing a part of that domestic and global economic opportunity related to the shift to EVs, what we found is that they're not really dabbling in, one policy or another. They're really taking a full court press approach, where they're introducing purchase incentives or other tax incentives that make electric vehicles more affordable. They're investing heavily in charging stations, but they're also doing 2 other pieces. One is they are all moving forward with some sort of supply side policy, whether it be very strong vehicle emission standards, a zero emission vehicle standard, which I mentioned before, which requires automakers to sell a certain percentage of EVs. And a number of jurisdictions, as you may have seen, are just announcing kind of full out bans on the sale of new gas cars by a certain timeline. And then finally, these countries or jurisdictions are really investing in their domestic auto sectors, whether it's, bailout packages with green strings attached, or providing funding to help retrain workers. These are kind of very clear industrial policy strategies. And so it's not just, these countries are not just viewing electric vehicles as an environmental opportunity. They're really seeing it as an economic opportunity based on the fact that EVs are the cars of the future. So, drawing from global best practices and where we're at right now, this is the Clean Cars Policy Package that Clean Energy Canada would like to see Canada adopt. We have started to take steps in the right direction. Canada does have a federal rebate program. We've got a slowly growing network of public charging stations. But to date, we have lacked the real ambition that other countries have pursued in really kind of accelerating the transition to EVs. So what we think we need in Canada is a package of policies that addresses both the demand side as well as the supply side barriers to EV uptake. So to highlight a few, we want to see more purchase incentives that make electric vehicles more affordable for Canadians across income levels. We want to see a faster build out of public charging stations, as well as certain, building code requirements that either require apartment building owners to install EV chargers or developers to make buildings EV ready, or requirements that make it easy for for tenants to install charging themselves. On the supply side, we want to see a zero emission vehicle standard that I've mentioned a few times that requires automakers to sell electric vehicles here. It'll help to even the playing field between BC and Quebec, and then the other provinces. And then we want to see we want to see Canada adopt some of the strongest vehicle emission standards in the world that not only help to push automakers to produce more electric vehicles, but also ensure that the gas cars they're continuing to sell are getting cleaner and cleaner over time. Finally, we want to see all of these policies paired with an auto sector strategy that helps to bring all of those ingredients I mentioned, the raw materials, the manufacturing prowess, the world-leading battery research and innovation, brings all of those pieces together and sets Canada's auto sector up to compete by building the cars of the future. Now, my time is 7:56. I think I will stop it there and leave time for questions. I did want to do a further spotlight on some of the, maybe I'll take just 2 minutes. So I wanted to take just a second to spotlight on these supply side policies, because as I mentioned, Canada, especially at the federal level, has done quite a bit on the demand side. We have the federal rebate program. We just saw that recapitalized with another nearly $300 million. Governments at all levels are working hard to build out public charging stations, but where we've really fallen short and where the government has not wanted to go as far as it could go is on the supply side. And so, two policies that are really dear to my heart and are incredibly important from an EV adoption perspective are vehicle emission standards and a zero emission vehicle standard. So let me just provide a little more detail. If we want to drive more EVs into the market, making sure that consumers who want to go electric can find a car to buy, these are the two options that can help us do that. So option A, vehicle emission standards. As I mentioned, Canadians keep choosing larger, more polluting vehicles. This is from an International Energy Agency study done in 2019. It looked at the fuel economy across major markets and found that Canada's light-duty vehicles had the worst tailpipe emissions in the world. Now, we can address this by adopting more stringent vehicle emission standards. This is the approach that the EU and Japan have taken, where they've moved forward with standards that are so ambitious, it effectively requires automakers to increase the number of zero-emission vehicles they sell to bring down their fleet average. Now, where Canada has an issue is that our standards are linked with the US standards. This was great under Obama when he pursued ambitious regulations that required automakers to improve the efficiency of their vehicle year after year. It was not so great under Trump when Trump worked very hard to roll those standards back, and those weakened standards now apply in Canada. And they're sort of the law of the land right now. To sum up, now under Biden, the US is deciding what it should do. We would like to see Canada play a little bit more of an active role in shaping that trajectory, as opposed to kind of waiting and seeing what the US does and then just adopting whatever the US puts in place. And so Canada needs to be a player at the table. We want to see more ambition. Stronger vehicle emission standards will help consumers to save money at the gas pump. It's one of the most important policies we have at our disposal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It'll improve air quality, get more zero-emission vehicles in the market, and make sure that our gas cars are getting cleaner and cleaner each year that they're still on the road, that they're still being sold. Second option is a zero emission vehicle standard. Now, Canada has set aspirational sales targets where we want to see electric vehicles make up 10% of all new car sales by 2025, 30% by 2030, and 100% by 2040. Right now, we have no way to get there. The projections are not looking good, and they're just aspirational. Now, we want to see these targets enshrined into law. Quebec, BC, California, and 10 other states have done that. Not necessarily aligning exactly with these targets, but they have put in zero emission vehicle standards that require automakers to sell an increasing percentage of EVs over time. Next slide. This, in terms of the benefits, I actually don't have a bullet here, but it provides market certainty, not only for automakers that know exactly where they need to go by when, but also the rest of the ecosystem. Electric utility companies will know how many EVs are we planning to add to our system by 2030, by 2040. Charging station providers will know exactly how much their technology is going to ramp up. Consumers will know we're going to be seeing more and more EV makes and models on dealership lots. And so that maybe the last point I'll make is that this sort of standard, it helps to recruit automakers to be part of the solution. You know, it's going to change their marketing tactics. We're starting to see a lot more commercials where automakers are trying to help us sell more EVs and get more Canadians and Americans driving them. It's also going to ensure that Canada as a market is prioritized. Right now, if you look at all of the automakers' major announcements, yes, many of them are increasing the number of EVs that they're putting out there, but they're prioritizing those markets that have stronger policies in place. So China's getting those cars first. The EU is certainly getting those cars first. You know, maybe California or Quebec could get them first. But we want to see Canada be a market that that automakers know they need to be selling their electric cars in. And here's a quote from General Motors CEO Mary Barras that says exactly that. You know, a majority of the electric cars are expected to be built and sold in China, where there are very strong policies to push those cars into the market. These two policies are currently being considered by the federal government, and stakeholder submissions are welcome. So, you know, if anyone listening today has strong feelings about these specific policies or other ways to increase the supply of EVs in Canada, then I'm sure the government would appreciate hearing from you. There are not many organizations plugged into this issue. And that's all from me. Looking forward to your questions.
Thanks, Joanna. That's terrific. That's terrific. I'm going to pass over to Jason now. Jason Arnaud. Jason, would you mind? It looks like we've got a raft of questions and comments here. So I'll let you have at it, sir.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Joanna. We do have quite a pile of questions, and we'll see how many we can get through. The first one, Joanna, with the federal MSRP limit for incentives stuck at $45,000, how will the feds capture all of the SUVs and pickups that are the largest part of the personal vehicle greenhouse gas liability?
Great question. So this is certainly a topic that is on the federal government's mind, and organizations like mine have been advocating for changes to the federal rebate program to make sure that, you know, SUVs and pickup trucks or folks who want to go electric but still drive those types of cars will be able to. I think at this stage, because there are still so few electric SUVs and pickup trucks in Canada's market, then we're not exactly sure what the price points will be. And I don't think the government would want to just choose a price point out of thin air. You know, I know a lot of thought went into that 45,000 MSRP for the first stage of the program. So yeah, I think this is all to say, certainly groups are advocating for changes to the program to capture those vehicle segments. We want to, I personally have trouble saying that we're going to incentivize people to drive larger vehicles, but I'm a culprit as well. We drive a Subaru Outback. We've got a daughter. We've got a lot of stuff that we need to pack in there. So for families and people who for work are driving these larger vehicles, we want to make sure they can go electric. And I expect that the government's thinking about that, and we'll hopefully see more on that in sometime in the future.
Okay, thank you. Next one is, how can we motivate both federal and provincial leadership to pay for EV rebates with a gas guzzler fee bait?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know, so an organization called Equiterre, which also works on light duty vehicle issues, they put out a great report a few months ago that makes the case for a fee bait in Canada and starts to lay out what that would look like. It makes a lot of sense because it provides a more sustainable revenue source for electric vehicle rebates. But I think there's a lot of concern that it would just be kind of political suicide, and that there would be pushback saying this is a second or a third carbon tax, and it's not fair. And it would be, particularly unfair to rural Canadians. And so I just think that there's a lot of political thinking that's going on there. And I'm not sure. Perhaps some sort of polling that could collect, Canadians' views on a fee bait and look at how acceptable it would be to them could help create space for government to move on that. Because I think it's really the voters that they're concerned with.
Okay, thank you. Next one, they move around on me. So the next one says, please offer ideas how to discourage government and companies from producing hybrids instead of EVs, as hybrids merely delay our transition to EVs and sustain our dependence on fossil fuels.
Yes, so I'm aware of a US study that came out recently showing kind of comparing the performance of hybrids, I believe plug-in hybrids as well, and battery electric vehicles. It would be great to have some, Canada specific studies showing that very clearly. But yeah, I think another way is to make sure that the rebates that are being offered by federal and provincial governments have, strong thresholds, either where hybrids are not at all eligible, or by making sure we're offering, a significantly lower rebate for those vehicles that don't perform as well in terms of emissions, which are going to be hybrids or some plug-in hybrids.
Okay, that sounds reasonable. This one I'm personally interested to hear the answer to. Are you aware of any federal politicians who are driving an EV?
Actually, you know what? I testified before the House of Commons Environment Committee in October or November, and there were MPs from obviously all political parties, and about 5 of the 10 drove EVs, and so I was surprised to hear, and that was including conservative MPs. So yeah, I can't remember them off the top of my head, but I could get back to someone via email if they wanted their specific names.
But they do exist.
They exist. They were more numerous than I expected.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's see. This one is related to a question you've already answered. The growth of the crossover SUV passenger vehicle segment seems to have contributed more to greenhouse gas emissions than most other types of vehicles. Do you think there may be an appetite to support purchase rebates for these types?
So yes, there's sort of two ways of going about this. Number one, we could try to disincentivize driving these larger vehicles at all. Um, I'm not sure how realistic that is. A lot of Canadians are choosing them, but that also means that going electric, while if you are kind of hell bent on driving an SUV or pickup truck, it'll be that much more important to make sure that there are electric options for those cars, because the emission benefits are that much better. And so I think we need some of those supply side policies that are requiring automakers to prioritize Canada, because they're announcing a number of new all electric SUVs and pickup trucks in the next few years. I've heard, 2021 was the year of the electric pickup truck. Can't remember if that was before COVID or after it, maybe before, but they're the next big segment to see turnover. And so we want to make sure those cars are going to be available to Canadians, so we can start, we can start making a dent in our emission profile from driving those cars or those larger vehicles.
Okay, great. Are you working with provincial governments as well? How are things going in Manitoba? It seems a good fit given the very clean electrical grid.
Great question. So we're a small team of, I believe we're 12 now, and we are located in Victoria, Vancouver, Ottawa, and Toronto. We don't have a presence in other provinces. And yeah, when I think of who is working on these issues in Manitoba, I'm not sure, but I know, it's easy to work with the leaders like British Columbia and Quebec because you have a captive audience. So we can always help them pursue greater and greater ambition. I was very thrilled to see the recent announcements from Nova Scotia come out, where they've introduced rebate programs and perhaps some investments in charging. But no, we are not currently engaged with the Manitoba government, and I wouldn't even know who to direct you to discuss that further. Maybe one other thing I'll add is we would love to be more engaged with the Ontario government, particularly given the economic opportunity that the province sees around EV production. But there has been very little interest in talking about EV uptake and policies to drive EV uptake in Ontario. In recent years, perhaps I'm hoping that will change soon.
Okay. Next question is, the Dunsky report is grouping all auto OEMs under one bucket. Some OEMs have ample inventory on their lots across all of Canada, but dealers cannot sell unless they have the right tools, education. So don't governments need to assist dealers with the high costs involved to sell and service EVs?
So the Dunsky report, I don't believe is, they break it out by automaker. And then of course, Tesla is a whole different story because they have no physical inventory. In terms of dealership, I agree. I think education and training and some efforts to make sure that dealers know how to answer consumer questions and are better positioned to sell EVs is important. Now, perhaps some of the responsibility falls on government. I would argue that some of the responsibility also falls on automakers, and that's part of why I think something like a zero emission vehicle standard would be effective, because, once automakers are involved in making sure that those EV sales are rising, then that might help change pricing and marketing and incentive structures and dealer training and education. So there's going to be a lot that happens on their side of things to help sell more EVs.
Okay, the next one is, why is produced in Canada linked to EV adoption? Canada is an integrated market and tied to the US, who supply many of the EVs for our market. So as long as the vehicles are available, why does where they're produced have any impact on EV adoption growth?
Great question. So 80% of electric vehicles are sold in the same region that they're made. And part of this has to do with how heavy batteries are, where it costs a lot and it's logistically challenging and it's dangerous to ship those big batteries over long distances, in part because they have hazardous substances. And so there is a relationship between where you build the cars and who's driving them. Now, yes, Canada is in an integrated market with the US, and I believe we export 80 or 90% of the cars that we make to the US. And so we think it's very important to work with the US and sort of take a North American approach to this issue. That said, I don't want to see Canada be in a position again where we're beholden to a foreign leader and it's poor decisions. So when President Trump rolled back those vehicle emission standards, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, their own analysis showed a net negative or a net cost to society, resulting in more premature deaths from air pollution and higher costs for consumers at the pump. And so I think we've got to keep both things in mind, where we're in an integrated market in terms of the policies we implement and the cars that we build and sell. But we also want to make sure that Canada can set its own course in terms of emissions and our economic growth.
Thank you. The next one isn't a question, but I'd love to hear your feedback on it. I believe it's Nova Scotia that's implemented a provincial incentive for EV purchases, including $500 for an e-bike. These are brilliant initiatives, and the inclusion of e-bikes is really special and should be implemented in all provinces.
So I can't say much on e-bikes. I have seen other experts in the field often say that they were skeptical of e-bikes and wondered, why wouldn't you just choose a regular bike? And I think that might have been my initial reaction as well. But I think that e-bikes can get to a lot of other folks in the population who, it's just a little bit too long to ride that commute without any sort of electric motor, or maybe there are older Canadians who would prefer to have that electric motor. So yeah, unfortunately, I can't speak to the impacts of e-bikes, but I often get the question, why are we continuing to promote driving? Shouldn't one of the solutions be to get out of our cars? And I 100% agree that is that's the best thing that we can do to reduce our emissions, is to get out of cars entirely. And so any sort of incentives that help people ride more public transit, cycle, or rather e-bikes is a positive direction in my mind.
Okay, thank you. And my 2 cents, I would say, if you haven't tried an e-bike, it's something you should go out and do, because the experience was not what I expected.
Okay.
And I can definitely see how it could encourage you to get out and bike more. It was very surprising.
Great, I will this summer.
Okay, next question. In your slide deck, page 8, how much of the savings are due to rebates and incentives? Why is the savings in Ontario so low?
We did not incorporate rebates in that analysis. It must have to do with electricity prices compared to gas prices. That was the real comparison. The data that we used to calculate that was from the Canada Energy Regulator. They put out a comparison of the levelized cost of driving an electric car and an internal combustion engine car. They had a bunch of comparisons where you can look at the comparison by province. You can look at, what's the difference in an SUV or a light duty truck. And so that's where that was from. And I expect the difference had to do with Ontario potentially having higher electricity prices.
Okay. Next one is, why no cash for clunkers type recommendation, perhaps for plugins only, which worked well to spur sales, especially hybrid sales in 2009?
We looked at cash for clunkers programs pretty extensively. We looked at how did they perform environmentally and economically following the global financial crisis of around 2008. A number of countries put one in place, and we were surprised to find that they actually did little to reduce emissions, and they weren't that great economically either. Often they did provide a good stimulus in that they pulled sales forward, so people bought cars earlier than they would have, but on net they didn't buy more cars. And so I think that the scrappage programs can be oversold on an environmental from an environmental perspective. If the government was to move forward with such a program, we would just advocate strongly that that the program only incentivize electric vehicles. Gas cars live for 12 or so years on the road, and to have government supporting the new purchase of gas cars when we say we want to have no new gas cars being sold by 2040, it just would run counter to our climate goals.
Okay. Quebec seems to be doing very well with their EV programs. Has the government compared the various provincial programs to help create a best of breed solution?
I think, yeah, so I agree. Quebec has done an excellent job, from the how high the rebates are that that province offers. They offer rebates for used electric vehicles, which we want to see at the federal level. Good home charging rebates, the zero-emission vehicle standard. Quebec is often looking at what California is doing, who is an obvious leader in this space. And then British Columbia as well. I think, we sort of see BC and Quebec as being in a race for who's more ambitious on electric vehicles. And certainly the federal government, is taking note. I think it's a big deal that 30% of Canada's car market is already covered by these ambitious policies in BC and Quebec. I think it's very hard for the federal government to move further without Ontario on board. And it's been unfortunate that there has been so little interest in driving EV adoption. And in fact, it's, at least at the beginning of Ford's term, there was hostility against it, where the EV rebates were immediately canceled. Charging stations were ripped out of the ground after they had been installed. Building code requirements were repealed. So I think that's the province we need to get at the table if we want to really do something big on the federal level.
And I'll continue from that and just insert my own question. Mm-hmm. How can we as citizens help promote that?
I think my sense is that the Ford government does really care where Ontarians are at and what Ontarians want. One thing that I appreciate about Premier Ford is that he's willing to change his mind. We've seen that in a few instances, once around the grain belt, somewhat around COVID. And so I think that some sort of kind of, a citizen letter writing campaign or a petition or something where Ontarians are saying, we want rebates. We want to see automakers selling more cars, more electric cars in Ontario. I think that would be quite effective. And similarly, I think that sort of campaign could help at the federal level, because these consultations are happening kind of so quietly, and there's a few environmental NGOs that have the resources to put forward to engage. Certainly automakers and their industry associations are providing their thoughts. So it would be great to hear from more Canadians as to what they would like to see.
Okay, thank you. Tim, time check. Do we have time for a few more?
I think we could probably maybe one more question, Jason, and then we should probably begin to wrap.
Okay, last one. Magna is one of the few Canadian EV companies. Why can't we use our supposed fantastic workforce to produce EVs and totally shift away from fossil fueled car production?
Well, we're going in that direction with Ford Motors, General Motors, and Stellantis making that shift. Toyota and Honda haven't yet announced any big EV plans in Canada, but I think our auto parts companies like Magna are beholden to what the assembly plants need, and so Magna is already pivoting to supply some electric vehicle parts, and they're engaged in joint ventures abroad to build entire EVs. But I think they would be ready and willing to take advantage of the EV opportunity, but they can't act alone. And one of the biggest pieces that we need to focus on is starting to build and manufacture batteries here in Canada, because that is just the anchor of the EV supply chain. It's the most valuable part. It's the hardest nut to crack. It's the hardest to deal with logistically because of their size and their value. So if we could get some battery manufacturing here in Canada, then that could really help us set us up to lead on EV production.
Okay, thank you again, Joanna, for all of those questions. Thank you everyone for submitting questions. Sorry we couldn't get through all of them, but appreciate the interest. Back to you, Tim.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Joanna. What a great segue. We actually have on some upcoming episodes already scheduled Canadian president for Magna, also a senior executive co-founder from Li-Cycle, which came up earlier in the conversation, a Canadian battery recycling company. So if you're interested in those things, keep an eye on the schedule. Joanna, that was just terrific. It's one of these episodes where we're just so flooded with questions. I think when we stopped, we still had some 50 questions in the queue. I might put you on the spot and see if we'll go through those questions. If there aren't a lot of duplicates, maybe we can get you to record an episode that we'll just post on our YouTube channel next to this one, so that we can address more of those questions. Am I putting you on the spot by saying that?
I'd be happy to.
Awesome. Thank you. I figured you would. You're great. But thanks a lot. You've really given us a better understanding of some of the drivers behind EV adoption in terms of policy that we can and should consider as we go forward. I know there's lots of debate about some of those items, but I think they're all great things to have on the table, and many of them should definitely be pursued. I think it's helpful for our audience to appreciate the work that goes on behind the scenes with and some of the thought processes involved to keep us all moving in the right direction. And I thank you very, very much, Joanna. That was a wonderful presentation. I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank Jason. Jason did a great job as usual. We had with all those Q&As. I know they jump around as people resort them, but you did a great job, and we appreciate it, along with all the work that goes on behind the scenes from all of the EV Society team that work on our webinars and promote them. So thanks to you all. For the rest of you, please do come back for another terrific episode of Canada Talks Electric Cars on April 6th, same time, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. when we're going to be hearing from Robert Horning. He's president and CEO of the Canadian Renewable Energy Association. Robert will be discussing the synergy between electric vehicles and renewables and how they will deliver tremendous benefits to Canadians. Thank you all for joining us on this month's webinar episode. We sincerely appreciate your continued support. And we also appreciate hearing from you by email about our webinar series. Whether complimentary or constructive, the feedback is extremely useful, and we look ahead to future topics and guest speakers. So from all of us at the Electric Vehicle Society, and until next month, please stay safe and stay well. This concludes today's webinar.